My manager looked me in the eye in a formal HR meeting, with a witness taking notes, and accused me of theft. And I looked right back at him, calm as still water, and told him he had the crime completely wrong. What I had done was not theft. What I had committed was embezzlement, a vastly more serious offense. I suggested, in the most measured tone I could manage, that they send me home immediately and convene the full disciplinary committee. And in the silence that followed, I watched the confidence drain right out of his face. He had spent months building a case against me. He had tried every angle, performance, procedure, policy, and none of it had worked because I was doing my job well. So he had manufactured a charge so petty, so deliberately absurd, that it should have made me snap. That was the plan. Get me emotional. Get me loud and insubordinate. Get me out the door before anyone looked too closely at his methods. What he did not count on was that I had 18 years of institutional patience and a very precise understanding of the law. And after that meeting, he doubled down. He posted a sign banning every employee in the company from charging their personal devices at work, which triggered a company-wide employee revolt, which forced upper management to reverse the policy entirely. And me, I had already brought a typewriter from home and was sitting at my desk, writing in complete compliance with every rule in the building. This is the story of how one petty manager tried to bury a man who refused to be buried, and how every move he made only dug the hole deeper for himself. Let me take you back to where it all started. For 18 years, I worked the graveyard shift, 2300 to 7 in the morning. Office buildings emptied out by sundown, and I was the last presence left, a single figure making rounds through darkened corridors, watching the floors go silent one by one as the rest of the world went home to dinner and sleep. On paper, it sounds like a grim existence, a consolation prize, something people fall into when better options have closed off. In reality, it was exactly what I had chosen, and I had chosen it deliberately. See, most people assume that taking a role well below your professional capabilities, modest pay, antisocial hours, the title of night security guard is some kind of quiet failure, a retreat from ambition. They would be wrong. I chose it because of what it gave me in those dark, quiet hours between midnight and sunrise. Time. Uninterrupted, unclaimed, structurally guaranteed time. The actual work of guarding an empty office building occupied, on a busy night, about 2 hours of an 8-hour shift. 2 hours of walking rounds, confirming keycards had been returned to their hooks, monitoring alarm systems, answering the occasional late-night phone call. That left 6 hours of what the security industry quietly and collectively calls idle time. And idle time, if you are disciplined about it, is not wasted time at all. My colleagues used it in different ways. Some watched television on a small screen at the desk. Some played phone games to stay awake. Some worked crossword puzzles. Others were college students who studied for exams or wrote thesis chapters during those same quiet hours, their textbooks spread across the reception counter. Nobody managed any of this. Nobody complained. This was simply how night security worked, how it had always worked, because 8 hours of active vigilance in a building where nothing was happening was not a sustainable human state. I used those 6 hours to write a novel. I had an iPad, a Bluetooth keyboard, and a power outlet in my assigned reception desk. I charged my equipment at work exactly as every single other person in that building charged theirs. And for nearly 2 decades, not a single person had ever found that worth remarking on. Then the new manager arrived. I will not say his name, but I will describe him because you have met this person before in some form or another. He was the particular breed of middle management that discovers, usually in their mid-30s, that the most efficient path to feeling powerful is to locate someone who does not appear to need their approval and make that person's life progressively more difficult until they do. I did not need his approval. I never had. My record was clean. My rounds were logged. My alarm responses were timely. By every measurable metric available to the company, I was performing above average. And that, it turned out, was precisely the problem. Because people who are already doing well do not give petty managers leverage over them, and leverage was what this man lived on. He started small, the way they always do. Little comments during walkthroughs about whether I was staying sufficiently engaged with the environment. Raised eyebrows when he spotted the iPad on the desk. Questions framed as concern. Was I finding enough to occupy my time during slower periods? Perhaps the idle hours could be filled more productively with additional rounds, more thorough log entries, expanded paperwork requirements. But he had no grounds for any of it. Not real ones. The work was being completed. The building was secure. I was not sleeping. I was not neglecting a single duty. And there was nothing in any contract or policy document that distinguished writing a novel during idle hours from watching television during idle hours. Both were equally permitted by absence of prohibition, so he was forced to get creative, to manufacture something where nothing real existed. Little did he know, and this is the part I want you to hold on to, I had been navigating institutional bureaucracies for 18 years, and I was considerably more patient than he was angry. The pressure that followed was not dramatic. It was incremental, methodical. Managers who operate the way he operated do not make big moves early. They understand, instinctively, that the goal is not a confrontation but an accumulation. A memo about professional conduct standards. A minor policy clarification distributed only to night staff. A note placed, casually, in the employee file about a minor procedural issue that had been resolved weeks earlier. He was building something, laying foundations. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it becomes visible. The late-night check-ins became more frequent, sometimes at 2 in the morning. Sometimes later, close to the end of my shift, when he must have calculated I might be tired and careless. The visits were always framed as routine. He would stand and scan the desk, scan me, ask leading questions about whether the most recent rounds had been completed, whether I had logged the keycard check-in times correctly, whether I was sure the rear stairwell alarm had been tested that week. I answered every question directly and accurately because the answers were always correct. And after each visit, I opened my personal notebook and wrote down the time, the date, and everything that had been said. Because I had learned, in 18 years of institutional employment, that when someone in authority begins building a case against you, the most powerful countermove is not confrontation. It is documentation. It is the quiet, unglamorous, patient act of recording the truth while it is still fresh. I had also spoken with my union representative. Quietly, informally, just to understand with precision what my contract actually guaranteed and what lines could not be legally crossed. That conversation turned out to be more valuable than I could have anticipated at the time, because people who lead with intimidation tend to be deeply confident in their read of other people and deeply careless about the details. They assume you will panic under sustained pressure. They assume you will make mistakes when the discomfort becomes sustained enough. They assume the power differential between a manager and a night shift employee has already decided the outcome before a single move is made. He had one strategy. He was going to goad me into losing my composure and fire me for insubordination. He had chosen the wrong person for that experiment. And then the call came, not an informal pull-aside in the hallway, not another 2 a.m. check-in framed as routine, a formal summons. I was to report to company headquarters. There would be a structured meeting. HR would be in attendance. Here is something worth understanding about 18 years of night shift work. It teaches you to wait. Not passive, anxious waiting, but the active, practiced stillness of a person who has spent thousands of hours sitting with uncertainty in the dark, not filling the silence with noise or panic. When you work nights, you learn that most of what feels urgent at 2 in the morning looks manageable at 7. You develop a baseline calm that becomes genuinely difficult to rattle. I drove to headquarters on the appointed morning, well-rested from a proper day's sleep, dressed appropriately, notebook in hand. I had called my union representative the evening before, not an alarm, but as a matter of professional preparation. I wanted to know exactly what I was walking into, even if I did not yet know the specific accusation. He gave me what I needed. The room was what you would expect. Small, deliberately institutional. One of those gray conference spaces that exist in every corporate building in the world, designed, whether consciously or not, to make the person sitting on the wrong side of the table feel small and outnumbered and exposed. My manager sat opposite me, settled and confident in the way that people are confident when they believe they have prepared something airtight. Beside him, a coordinator from HR with a notepad and the studied neutrality of someone trained to appear impartial. They had printed documents, an itemized record, a timeline. They had the practiced air of institutional authority, the suggestion that the outcome of this meeting had been determined before anyone sat down. They had genuinely no idea that the moment they opened their mouths, they were handing me the instrument of their own undoing. My manager straightened in his chair. He cleared his throat. And then he said the words that, "I want you to understand this clearly," were designed with one purpose: not to discipline me, not to build a legitimate case. To provoke me into saying something he could use. He called me a thief. Stealing electricity. That was the charge. Charging an iPad and a Bluetooth keyboard, devices used quietly during 6 hours of idle time in an industry where this was standard, universal, uncontested practice across every shift at every location, was being formally presented as theft, with documents, with HR present, with a straight face. I want you to sit with that for a moment. An iPad charging cycle draws roughly the same electrical load as a 60-watt light bulb running for a couple of hours. The cost to the company was fractions of a cent per shift. Annualized, over an entire year of nightly charges, we might be discussing a figure of a few dollars, perhaps $5, perhaps slightly more. And here we sat, documents printed on company letterhead, an HR coordinator with her pen poised, treating this as a disciplinary matter serious enough to warrant a formal meeting at headquarters. Do you see what this actually was? Because I saw it the moment he said it. This had nothing to do with electricity. The accusation was not meant to be believed or prosecuted. It was theater, deliberate, calculated provocation. The charge was designed to be so absurd, so disproportionately petty, that a reasonable person would react to it with visible indignation, with sputtering outrage, with exactly the kind of emotional, elevated, insubordinate response that could then be documented, reported, and used as grounds for the dismissal he actually wanted. The electricity was a stick. He was hoping I would lunge at it. I did not lunge. Instead, I let the silence in that room breathe for a moment. I looked at the documents. I looked at the HR coordinator. I looked at my manager. And then I said, very quietly and very precisely, that if they intended to accuse me of something, they needed to do it properly and correctly, because I had not committed theft. Theft, as any basic reading of criminal law will confirm, requires the taking of property from a person or location that one has no right to access. But the electrical outlets at my reception desk were not someone else's property being taken without authorization. They were in my assigned area, under my professional supervision. Part of the infrastructure I was contractually responsible for managing and maintaining. I had not taken something that wasn't mine. I had misappropriated a resource entrusted to my care. That was not theft. That was embezzlement. Watch what happened next. Watch it carefully, because this is the exact moment the trap reverses direction. I laid it out for them slowly and without theater, the way you explain something to people who have clearly not thought their position all the way through. If they intended to pursue this matter, they needed to categorize it accurately. And the accurate categorization was embezzlement, the criminal misappropriation of resources entrusted to one's professional care. Not a personnel matter, not a minor conduct issue, a criminal charge, which meant that the appropriate procedural response was not a quiet conversation in a gray conference room. It was suspension, pending a formal review by the full disciplinary committee. Not a manager and an HR coordinator. A committee, with proper procedural rules, with formal representation on both sides. At which point, I mentioned, I would be consulting with my union representative before any further conversation on the subject took place. The HR coordinator's pen stopped moving. My manager's posture shifted. Here is the beautiful and devastating logic of what had just happened. In attempting to frame the most trivially petty possible accusation, one designed to be too embarrassing and absurd for me to defend against rationally, he had accidentally made it too serious to quietly pursue. You can dismiss someone informally for minor workplace misconduct. You cannot dismiss someone for criminal embezzlement without going through every single formal channel. The committee review, the procedural protections, the union representation, the documented hearing, the entire apparatus. He had built a mousetrap, and he had not noticed that his own hand was inside it. They retracted. Not gracefully, and without any acknowledgement that the accusation had been manufactured for the purpose of provocation. Just a sudden, quiet withdrawal. The documents were closed. The tone shifted. I was told, in the vague language of institutional retreat, that we could approach this differently and that perhaps the matter could be considered resolved. I nodded. I agreed to the resolution. I said very little else. I shook hands. I thanked them for their time. I walked out through the gray lobby and into the parking lot. And there, in the open air with nobody watching, I allowed myself a smile. The first real one I had felt in months. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not over. Because petty people with institutional power do not accept defeat gracefully. They regroup. They look for a smaller angle, and they try again. I was right. He was not done. About a week after the meeting, After the retraction, after the quiet institutional retreat, after he had gone back to whatever he used for an office and sat with the knowledge that his plan had collapsed in real time, a sign appeared in the security area. Printed on company letterhead, laminated, posted conspicuously on the wall near the reception desk where I worked. It read, "No personal devices may be charged using company electrical outlets." That was it. That was his countermove. After months of surveillance, after building a documented case, after a formal HR meeting at headquarters, after watching his legal accusation get legally reframed into a worse crime than the one he had leveled, the best he could produce was a sign about phone chargers. Now, and I am going to stop here and ask you something directly, because I think this is genuinely worth considering. If you were that manager, and you had just failed as completely and publicly as he had, what would your next move be? You would probably regroup. Assess. Maybe accept, with some measure of professional dignity, that you had overplayed your hand against someone who was more prepared than you anticipated. You would find a quiet way to disengage and redirect your energy somewhere more productive. He posted a sign. I will be honest with you, when I saw it, I felt something close to pity. The smallness of it, the transparency, the desperation disguised as policy. But I also noticed something that he had apparently not thought through. I had a Nokia phone. Not a smartphone, a proper old Nokia, the kind that holds a charge for 5 to 7 days on a single battery. I did not need to charge anything at work except my iPad and my keyboard. And if those were now forbidden, I had been thinking about this problem since the day of the HR meeting, when I first began to suspect that a retaliatory policy might be coming. I had thought through every possible response. I had settled, with great satisfaction, on the one that was simultaneously the most compliant, the most productive, and the most perfectly, quietly ridiculous. I went home that evening and went to the storage closet, and I pulled out something I had not used in several years, but had never quite been able to throw away. A typewriter, not a modern one with electronic components, not something that needed a power source of any kind. A proper, fully mechanical, manual typewriter, the kind built in an era before anyone imagined that electricity might one day be considered a workplace resource worth regulating. The kind that runs on nothing but keystrokes and intention. The kind that, when placed on a quiet reception desk at 2 in the morning in an empty office building, makes a sound like small controlled thunder with every letter pressed. I brought it to work. I set it on the center of the reception desk, clearly visible, positioned with care, and I wrote, every night, methodically, productively, in complete and demonstrable compliance with every policy that had ever been posted or distributed in that building. No personal devices, no charging required, no electricity consumed beyond what the desk lamp drew, just ink and paper, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had absolutely nothing to apologize for and no one who could make him feel otherwise. I am told my manager saw me at the typewriter during one of his check-ins. I did not see his face. I did not need to. I had thought carefully about what his expression would look like, and I was confident the reality matched the image. But here is where the story stops being about me and starts being about everyone else. Because while I was sitting comfortably behind a mechanical typewriter, Nokia resting in my pocket, battery life measured in days rather than hours, the rest of the security staff across the company was not doing well at all. They had smartphones. Current, modern, battery-intensive smartphones that needed charging every single day. Night shift is 8 hours. 8 hours is a long time to watch a phone battery count down from full to dead. And now, because a manager at one location had lost an argument with one employee and needed to feel like he had won something, anything nobody at any location was permitted to plug in. The sign had gone up at my desk. But company policy, once formalized and distributed, does not apply selectively. It applies everywhere, to everyone, and the people it now applied to were furious. The complaint started at my location first. My coworkers went to their immediate supervisors and asked, with genuine confusion, why the rule existed. They received no satisfying answer because there was no satisfying answer available. The policy had not been created to serve any operational, legal, or safety purpose. It existed because one manager, at one site, had lost an argument in a conference room and needed to manufacture a small victory to carry home. That was the complete and entire origin story of this company-wide electrical policy. Not strategic planning, not risk management. Wounded pride wearing a corporate uniform. But policies, once formalized and posted on company letterhead, do not carry their origin stories with them. They just become rules. Rules that apply everywhere. And this particular rule had significant real-world consequences for people who were not part of the original dispute in any way. Consider what 8 hours of dead phone means for a night security worker. It means no access to emergency contacts, no ability to call family during a welfare check, no backup communication if the building's landline system fails. Some workers relied on their phones for medical applications. Some had children at home and needed to remain reachable. The policy, in trying to punish one person for a non-offense, had accidentally created a genuine hardship for dozens of employees across multiple locations. The complaints spread, not quietly, from my location to the next, from night shifts to day shifts when colleagues compared notes at handover. Supervisors at other buildings began receiving questions from their staff. Why can't we charge our phones? What is the safety plan if a phone dies mid-shift? Who approved this and what was the reasoning behind it? There were no good answers to any of these questions because the reasoning was not good. And in an institutional environment, a policy without defensible reasoning does not survive long-term scrutiny. Upper management became aware of the situation, not through my manager's briefings, through the volume and geographic spread of the employee complaints. And upper management, to their credit, asked exactly the right question: why does this policy exist? The answer, when traced back to its source, was not an answer anyone in a position of oversight wanted to defend. The sign came down, at every location, every copy. An official communication was distributed. Personal device charging was a permitted and standard practice, and there was no policy prohibiting it at any company location. Everything was exactly as it had been before any of this started. Except, of course, for the small fact that an entire sequence of events had unfolded, events that began with one man's deliberate, manufactured accusation, and the only person whose position in the company remained unchanged, undamaged, and completely intact was me. I put the typewriter back in the storage closet, thanked it silently for its service, returned my iPad and Bluetooth keyboard to the reception desk, plugged in the charger, and sat back down to write. He never tried again, not in any direct form. The late-night check-ins became infrequent, then stopped. The memos tapered off. The performance notes disappeared from my file. The pressure, that sustained, calculated, grinding institutional pressure that had defined the previous months, simply ceased. The way it always eventually ceases when the person applying it has spent all their ammunition and hit nothing but air. I stayed in that position for several more years after that, completed every round, logged every keycard, answered every alarm, maintained every duty that the contract required of me, and in the 6 hours between the actual work, those hours that belong to every night security worker who has ever kept a building safe through the dark, I wrote my novel. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Where is the dramatic finale? Where is the public humiliation, the formal demotion, the satisfying moment where authority steps in and delivers a consequence proportionate to what he attempted? Here is my honest answer. It did not happen that way. He kept his role. He managed other people. Life in that organization continued in the ordinary way that institutional life continues when nothing has technically been proven and no one wants to file paperwork. But I believe, and I believe this genuinely, not as consolation, that he became more careful after that. That something in the experience of watching a legal accusation reframe itself into a worse crime, and then watching a retaliatory sign trigger an employee revolt, and then watching upper management reverse everything he had built, something in that sequence permanently altered his calculus about which targets were worth pursuing. And the novel? In the Netherlands, intellectual property law is unambiguous on this point. Work created using your own tools during your own time is your property. The company was entitled to nothing from those hours, not a percentage, not an acknowledgement, not a word. The idle hours were mine. They had always been mine, and they remained mine. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. There is a particular kind of person who interprets other people's peace as a personal provocation, who looks at someone who is calm, self-directed, productive, and fundamentally unconcerned with their opinion, and feels, in some deep and unexamined place, that this composure needs to be punished, disrupted, brought down to a more manageable level. My manager was that person. He saw a man writing quietly at a desk during 6 hours that belonged to no one, and something in him decided that someone ought to be able to stop it. He was wrong. And the way in which he was wrong is the most satisfying part of this entire story to me, more satisfying even than the typewriter, which I will admit gave me considerable private joy. Because the thing about people who build pressure campaigns against calm, prepared targets is that they always overreach. They always go one move too far. They manufacture a charge too absurd to survive scrutiny. They post a sign too sweeping to enforce fairly. And in doing so, in that moment of overreach, they hand you the exact tools you need to dismantle everything they thought they had constructed. I never raised my voice. I never threatened him. I never went around him to his supervisors, never filed a grievance, never made a single dramatic move. I knew the rules. I applied them precisely, and I let him walk, step by deliberate step, into the consequences of his own actions. That is what real karma looks like, not the lightning bolt version, not the dramatic confrontation in the parking lot. The slow, grinding, inevitable kind, the kind that unfolds quietly while you are sitting at your desk, writing by typewriter at 2 in the morning, entirely at peace with who you are and what you are doing. Patience is the longest game, and it wins. If this story gave you that feeling, the specific, deep satisfaction of watching someone's own trap close around them, drop a like. It means the world, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to reach more people. And if you want more cold karma, more stories about people who tried to break someone who simply refused to break, hit subscribe. We post every single day. And I promise you, the stories only get better from here. Stay calm, stay patient, stay precise. Justice always finds a way.